The chamber was already full when I walked in, and not a single head turned. 11 species, 83 delegates, 1 human. That was how it always went. I took my seat at the far end of the curved table, the seat nearest the door, which was not an accident, because the conclave of races had built this room before humanity had ever left its own solar system, and the architects had not left space for us. When we joined, 30 years ago, they slid a smaller chair into the gap near the exit and called it diplomacy. My name is Yara Osei Mensah. I had been sitting in that chair for 11 years. I placed my data tablet on the table, opened my notes from the previous session, and waited for Ambassador Veth Karn, the lead elder of the Veth delegation, a tall, gray-skinned creature with 4 eyes arranged in a perfect square across his face, to finish whatever sentence he had started before I arrived. He did not pause when I sat down. He did not pause because he had not noticed me arrive. He had never, in 11 years, noticed when I arrived. I had learned to stop taking it personally around year 4. The session that morning was about resource allocation in the outer trade rings. The Duvari wanted expanded mining rights near the Felon corridor. The Reth Collective was pushing back. The Veth wanted a transit fee restructure. Everyone had something to say, and everyone said it at length. And the presiding intelligence, a cool, genderless voice the conclave called the Arbiter, logged every word with perfect efficiency. I had 7 items on my agenda. 3 were carryovers from the previous month. 2 had been on the docket since last year. 1 had been formally submitted 18 months ago and was still awaiting a placement slot. The 7th was new, a request from Earth's Agriculture Cooperative for emergency reclassification of a fungal pathogen spreading through human colony food crops on 3 outer planets. People were going hungry. The reclassification would unlock emergency supply channels through conclave distribution networks. I had filed the request in the proper format, attached all 42 supporting documents, and submitted it through the correct portal, 11 days ahead of the required deadline. I watched the morning session run its course. My items were not called. At the midpoint break, I approached the Arbiter's floor terminal and asked when the human agenda items would be scheduled. Items submitted by the Sol delegation are currently in queue, the Arbiter said. Priority placement is assigned by tier standing and submission weight. The pathogen reclassification is a health matter, I said. Category 3 emergency. By conclave standards. Confirmed. Category 3 emergencies are processed within 90 days for Tier 2 members and within 14 days for Tier 1 members. The Sol delegation holds Tier 2 observer status. People are hungry now, I said. Not in 90 days. The queue cannot be manually adjusted without a Tier 1 motion, the Arbiter said. You may submit a petition requesting that a Tier 1 member table a motion on your behalf. I had done that before. Twice. Both times, the petition had been received warmly in private and ignored in session. There was nothing wrong with the conclave's rules. The rules worked perfectly. They simply worked perfectly for everyone who had written them, which was not us. I went back to my seat and spent the break writing objection number 731. After the break, Veth Karn began a 40-minute presentation on transit lane reconfiguration in the mid-ring sectors. It was elegant, well-researched, and deeply boring, in the way that only truly powerful people can afford to be boring, because they know no one will leave. I took notes. I found 2 points that directly contradicted agreements humanity had negotiated 3 years prior, and I flagged them in my system, prepared to raise them when he finished. He finished. The Arbiter opened the floor. I raised my hand. Veth Karn began speaking again, addressing a point that one of the Reth delegates had apparently made through a side channel during his presentation. The Arbiter noted that the floor was now engaged in a cross-delegation exchange, and that new voices would be queued. I lowered my hand. I queued my voice. I waited 12 minutes. When I was finally recognized, I had barely finished my second sentence before Veth Karn cut across me. Not rudely, not with any visible malice. He simply spoke, the way a person speaks when it does not occur to them that anyone else might currently be speaking. The transit recalibration in Sector 9, he said, addressing the Reth delegate, will of course account for existing agreements, which, I should note, were all catalogued in the supplemental filing. The Reth delegate nodded. 2 other delegates murmured agreement. The conversation moved on. I sat with my second unfinished sentence still open on my screen. The Arbiter's log would record this as an informal exchange. It always did. I had counted 40 interactions over the years that the Arbiter had classified this way, each one an interruption of a human delegate, each one absorbed into the vast machinery of conclave procedure, without friction or consequence, because the friction had been absorbed by the human in the chair, and we were very good at absorbing friction. We had been practicing for a long time. At the end of the session, as the delegates filed out in small clusters of their own species, speaking in their own languages about dinners and agreements and the texture of the coming political season, I remained at my seat for a moment. The chamber slowly emptied. The lights dimmed to their resting state. The Arbiter's floor terminal went to standby. I finished writing objection number 731. I formatted it correctly. I attached the relevant transcripts. I submitted it through the proper portal. Then I sat looking at the screen for a while. I thought about Kwame, my youngest brother, who worked on one of the outer colony planets, the one where the fungal pathogen had reached the eastern growing districts. He had sent me a message 2 weeks ago, casual in tone, mentioning that the local market shelves were getting thin. He had not asked me to do anything. He knew better by now. I thought about the 42 supporting documents I had submitted for the emergency reclassification. I thought about the Tier 1 motion I had petitioned for and never received. I thought about 90 days, and the definition of the word emergency. I thought about 11 years of this chair, this room, this distance between the seat near the door and the center of the table, where every decision that mattered was actually made. I closed my terminal. I picked up my tablet. I stood up and walked out of the chamber, and the door slid shut behind me with a sound like a long, quiet breath. In the corridor, the lights were bright and cold, and the conclave station hummed with the business of 1,000 species going about their days. A group of Duvari researchers passed me without acknowledgement, deep in conversation. A cleaning unit rolled past my feet. Somewhere down the corridor, the scent of whatever the Veth delegation ate for lunch drifted from the direction of their private dining hall. Something warm and sweet that I had learned, in 11 years, was not for me. I walked to the human embassy wing. I passed the small plaque beside our door that read, Sole Delegation, Observer Status, Tier 2, in conclave standard script. Someone had printed a sticker of Earth below it, small and blue, and slightly crooked. One of the junior staff, probably. I had never told them to remove it. Inside, my assistant Oliver Marsh was waiting with a stack of physical files and an expression I recognized. It was the expression he wore when something had gone wrong, but he had decided I already knew about it and was choosing my reaction carefully. The pathogen petition? I said. Returned, he said. Administrative insufficiency. They say the emergency classification documentation needs to be co-signed by a Tier 1 medical authority. Which we are not. Which we are not. I took the files from him. I set them on my desk. I sat down in my chair, a real chair, one I had brought from Earth, because the conclave furniture was not designed for human proportions, and I looked at the stack of returned documents and the screen showing 37 pending responses, none from the Tier 1 delegates I had contacted, and the small framed photograph of my brother, standing in a field on a colony planet, with a sky the color of copper, and a smile that had nothing to do with politics. I opened a new document. I wrote objection number 732. I did not send it. I sat for a long time with the cursor blinking at the end of the last sentence. Then I closed the document, stood up and walked to the window. The station's observation panel showed the black between stars, immense and indifferent, the same view I had looked at for 11 years, and I found that I was not sad. I was not frustrated. I was not angry in the way that burns. I was something quieter than all of that, something that had taken 11 years to arrive, and had finally, in the last 30 seconds, finished its journey. I did not have a word for it yet, but it felt, more than anything else, like clarity. The Keth Nebula Accord had been in discussion for 2 years, and I had known from the first briefing document that it would not end well for us. That was not a prediction based on any special intelligence. It was arithmetic. The Accord was a restructuring of transit lanes, trade corridors, and territorial usage rights across a wide band of space that included, incidentally, quietly, tucked into page 47 of the main document and Appendix F of the supplemental filing, several pathways that ran directly through the Sol system's orbital neighborhood, not near it, through it. Through the space where Earth's outer relay stations sat, where human colony supply ships ran their standard routes, where the gravitational geometry of our own sun made certain corridors the only efficient option for crossing that part of the galaxy. The conclave had not asked us about this. We were an interested observer. Tier 2 members did not vote on Tier 1 accords. We could submit commentary, which would be noted. We could raise procedural concerns, which would be logged. We could formally request a review period extension, which, after 30 days, would be returned as administratively insufficient, if not co-signed by a Tier 1 authority. I had submitted commentary. I had raised procedural concerns. I had requested a review extension. The commentary was noted. The procedural concerns were logged. The extension request came back on the 29th day. Administratively insufficient, missing a Tier 1 co-signature. I had asked Delegate Veth Karn personally, in writing, for a co-signature. He had replied 3 weeks later with a warm note expressing his deep respect for humanity's growing role in galactic affairs, and his confidence that the Accord's implementation team would address any transit concerns through the standard operational review process, which would begin approximately 14 months after ratification. I had read that message 4 times. The 5th time, I noticed that it did not contain the word no anywhere. It also did not contain anything that could be described as a yes. It was a perfect document, a full page of language that communicated, with great warmth and precision, absolutely nothing. On the day of the vote, the chamber was full. This was unusual. Normally, conclave sessions had a scattered attendance, delegates drifting in and out, secondary staff filling seats. But the Keth Nebula Accord was significant, the kind of agreement that would reshape trade and territorial relationships for decades. And so every delegation had sent its full complement, and the room had a current of energy that felt almost festive. The Veth delegation wore formal attire, long layered garments in deep colors. The Duvari had brought their ceremonial translation collars, which they only used on important occasions. Even the usually sparse Reth contingent had arrived in numbers, their low, wide bodies arranged along their section of the curved table, like a row of quiet stones. I sat in my chair near the door. I was wearing the same suit I always wore. The session opened. The arbiter read the accord summary. Delegates made brief statements of position, most supportive, a few with minor reservations already recorded, all manageable within the framework. The presiding voice was smooth and measured, the language of institutions doing exactly what they were built to do. I had a prepared statement. It was 4 minutes long. I had timed it. It explained, clearly and without any personal emotion, the specific operational impact of 3 transit corridor designations on human supply routes and Earth's outer relay infrastructure. It asked for nothing dramatic: a small boundary adjustment, a consultation clause, a joint review committee. It was, I believed, the most reasonable document I had ever written, and I had written 732 objections, so I had a reasonable baseline for comparison. When the floor opened for final comment before the vote, I raised my hand. The arbiter acknowledged me. I began to speak. I had finished my first paragraph, the one explaining the geographic specifics, the one with the data, when the chamber's ambient murmur shifted. Delegates were already reaching for their voting chips. The energy in the room had moved past the commentary phase and into the closing ritual of a decision already made, not because anyone was being deliberately rude, because they had already decided, and the commentary of a Tier 2 observer was, in the rhythm of these sessions, a formality that the room processed the way you process background music. Present, noted, not really heard. I kept speaking. I finished the first paragraph. I began the second. I was explaining the supply chain impact when the arbiter's voice came over mine, smooth and clean, like water over stone. Thank you, Representative Ose Mensa. The floor will now proceed to vote. I stopped speaking. Not because I was told to exactly. I had not been told to stop. I had been thanked, which is a different thing, but which produces the same result. The vote proceeded. 800 delegates cast their chips. The arbiter tallied in real time, the numbers climbing on the chamber's main display. The accord passed by a majority of 73%, with 12 abstentions and no formal opposition. No formal opposition, because there was no mechanism for a Tier 2 observer to register formal opposition. You could submit commentary. You could raise concerns. You could stand in the room and speak your second paragraph into a vote that was already happening, and be thanked for your contribution to the process. I sat with my statement still open on my tablet. The second paragraph. The third. The conclusion, which I had spent 2 hours writing, because I had wanted it to be reasonable but clear, human, but not emotional, firm, but not aggressive. I had wanted it to say, "We are here. We are affected. We matter to this decision." I had worked very hard on that conclusion. I folded the tablet closed. Around me, delegates were shaking hands, or the equivalent for their species, exchanging congratulations, beginning the social choreography of a successful session. The Veth Elder was at the center of it, gracious and enormous, receiving the warm acknowledgments of allied delegations with the ease of someone who had never once doubted that this room was built for him. I stood up. I picked up my tablet. I walked to the Arbiter's floor terminal. "I would like to register a formal protest of the Keth Nebula Accord, on behalf of the Sol delegation," I said. "Protest received," the Arbiter said. "Tier 2 protests regarding Tier 1 decisions are logged and presented to the full assembly at the next available review session. Current queue places the next review in approximately 11 months. 11 months? Correct. The transit corridor changes take effect in 6. Correct." I looked at the terminal for a moment. The terminal looked back, or rather, it did not look back, because it was a terminal, and it had already moved on to the next item in its queue, and I was standing in front of it having a conversation with something that was no longer listening. "Thank you," I said. I walked back through the chamber, which was still buzzing with post-vote energy. No one stopped me. No one said anything to me. I passed the Veth Elder, who was mid-conversation with the Duvari chief delegate, and who glanced briefly in my direction, without any particular expression, and then looked away. I walked out of the chamber and down the corridor to the human embassy wing, and I sat at my desk, and I turned on my screen, and I looked at it for a long time. Then I opened a transmission channel to Earth. Not to the diplomatic office, not to the Foreign Relations Committee, to the full governing assembly, every regional council, every elected chamber, every administrative body that had any hand in human interstellar policy. I pulled up the complete session record from that morning, the accord summary, the vote tally, the delegate statements, the arbiter's log, my own prepared statement with its neat line break at the end of the first paragraph, where I had been thanked and the floor had moved on. I attached everything, every document, every log entry, 47 supporting files including the previous 2 years of commentary submissions, procedural concerns, extension requests, and the warm, empty reply from Veth Karn that did not contain the word no. I did not write a cover message. I wrote 3 drafts and deleted them all. They were too emotional, or not emotional enough, or too measured, or not measured enough. I could not find a tone that felt right for what I was trying to say, which was not really a diplomatic thing, and not really a political thing, but something more like, look, just look at this. Look at what I have been sitting in for 11 years. Look at what was just done to us in a room where we had a chair but not a voice. Just look. In the end, I wrote 2 words, session record. I sent it. Then I closed the channel, turned off the overhead light, and sat in the dark of the embassy office with the black of space outside the window, and the hum of the station around me, and a silence that felt, for the first time in a long time, like it belonged to me. I did not know what would happen next. Nobody had told me anything. No one had called to say we had a plan, or called to say we did not. Earth was not a place that telegraphed its decisions before making them. That was, I thought, perhaps one of the things about us that the conclave had never fully understood, that our silence was not the same as our absence, and that when we went quiet, it did not mean we had nothing to say. It meant we were thinking. The weeks that followed had a specific quality that I did not have a word for in any of the 7 languages I spoke. The closest I could come was the Duvari concept of Tesh Kavar, which translates roughly as, The moment before weather changes, when the air has already decided. There was an ordinary rhythm to things. Sessions, filings, corridor walks, meals. But underneath it something had shifted, and I could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure. Not through any one sense, but through everything at once. I attended sessions. I filed objections. I raised my hand, and sometimes I was recognized, and sometimes I was thanked into silence. Nothing had changed in the daily texture of my work, and yet I found that I was doing it differently. Lighter somehow, less weight on each word, because I was less invested in whether each word landed. Something in me had made a decision that my conscious mind had not yet been told about. 3 weeks after I sent the transmission, a message arrived from Earth. It was brief. It was encrypted to my personal credentials, which meant it had not gone through the standard diplomatic channels. It was from Coordinator Adeyeze Nwosu, the head of the Interstellar Relations Assembly, who I had met in person twice in 11 years, once at the start of my appointment and once at the 5-year review, and who had the precise, careful quality of someone who chose every word the way an engineer chooses load-bearing materials. The message contained 2 sentences. "Come home, Yara. We are done here." I read it twice. I sat with it for a while. Then I read it a 3rd time, not because I had missed something, but because I wanted to understand the full weight of it, and I found that the more I looked at it, the heavier it became, in the way that small things sometimes are when they contain something enormous inside them. We are done here. Not we are reconsidering our position. Not we are pursuing alternative diplomatic channels. Not we are requesting an emergency review of our Tier 2 standing. Done. A word that closed a door. A word that required no footnote, no appendix, no supplemental filing co-signed by a Tier 1 authority. I set the message aside and opened my desk drawer. It was a deep drawer, the kind built for physical files in an era when most things were physical, and I had used it over the years to store things that did not belong in any official system. Handwritten notes, a photograph of my family, a small stone I had carried from a beach in Ghana that I sometimes held in my hand during very long sessions because the weight of it was real and cool and asked nothing of me. I reached past all of those things and pulled out a data chip I had prepared 18 months ago, one night in a moment of something I had told myself was idle curiosity. On the chip was a document I had written in a single long session and then never opened again. It was a complete inventory. Every operation the human delegation ran within or adjacent to conclave infrastructure. Every agreement we maintained, every station we staffed, every service we provided, every route we facilitated. I had written it out of habit, the habit of a person who has spent 11 years in a place where the only power she had was knowing the facts precisely. I plugged the chip into my terminal and opened the file. I read it for the first time since writing it. I read it a second time more slowly. By the 3rd time, I was not reading it anymore. I was just sitting with what it meant, which was something that the conclave, I was fairly certain, had never sat with at all. We were not decorative. We had never been decorative. We had been, for 30 years, the species that did the unglamorous things, the difficult-to-staff things, the necessary but unrewarding things, because we were new and eager, and had not yet learned that eagerness in this place was treated as a form of need. We had run the deep quarantine stations that no other species wanted to maintain, because the work was isolated, and the posting was years long, and the conditions were medically demanding, in ways that did not suit most conclave biologies. We had staffed the cross-species translation archives, adding 17 new human languages to the index, and maintaining the indexing systems for 60 others, because we had a talent for pattern recognition in language, and no one else had noticed the archives were deteriorating. We had operated the Cascade Drive repair docks in the mid-ring sectors, the only certified ones in this quadrant, because human engineers had developed a specific compatibility with that drive system's mechanical architecture that no other species had replicated, and because when the conclave had quietly decommissioned the previous operator, we had stepped in, as we always did, because something needed doing. None of this was on any list anywhere in conclave records labeled essential services. We had never been classified as essential. We were Tier 2 observers. We were promising but premature. We were the species in the chair near the door, absorbing friction. I closed the file. I put the data chip in my jacket pocket, Then I did something I had not done in 11 years of this posting. I sent Oliver home. Not for the evening. Home, Earth. I told him to book passage on the next available transport, and to take the junior staff with him, and that I would explain later, and that there was nothing wrong except that some things were changing, and I would rather they were home when the changes happened. Oliver looked at me the way people look at you when they understand something without being told it, and are deciding whether to ask anyway. He was a careful man, Oliver, and he had been my assistant for 6 years, and he knew me well enough to read the spaces between my sentences. He did not ask. He nodded. "Should I pack the embassy records?" he said. "Everything," I said. "The entire archive. Personal items, institutional files, the physical ones in the back room. Everything. That will take most of tonight." "I know," I said. "Take most of tonight." He left to begin. I sat at my desk and opened a new message, and I began to write. Not to the conclave, not to any delegation, not to the arbiter or the queue system, or the Tier 1 co-signature process. I wrote to every human coordinator, every colony administrator, every relay station operator, every dock manager, every archivist, every quarantine station medic, every supply route controller, every engineer, on every mid-ring cascade dock, in clear and simple language, in the same tone I used when describing facts precisely, which was the only tone I trusted for important things. I told them what was happening. I told them what to do. I told them when. I sent the message at midnight station time. Then I turned off my desk light, leaned back in my human chair that I had brought from Earth because the conclave furniture was not designed for me, and I looked out at the black between stars, and I felt the Tesh Kavar, the moment before weather changes, when the air has already decided, settle around me like something that had been waiting a long time to land. There was a great deal still to do, but the decision, I realized, had already been made. It had been made before Coordinator Nuosu's 2 sentences. It had been made before the Keth Nebula vote. It had been made, perhaps, on the day I wrote objection number 732, and sat with the cursor blinking and did not send it. I had just not known it yet. Now I did. I put on my jacket, picked up my data chip, and went to help Oliver pack. On the morning of the 48th hour, I turned off the lights in the Sol Delegation Embassy for the last time. It was not a dramatic moment. The switch was a standard panel beside the door, the same brushed metal design used throughout the station, not built for human hands but close enough that it had never been a problem. I pressed it. The lights went out. The room behind me became dark and quiet, stripped of everything we had brought. The files, the chairs, the framed photograph that Oliver had carefully wrapped in a cloth and placed in the last case. Even the small blue Earth sticker that someone's junior staff had put on the plaque beside the door, Oliver had peeled it off at the last minute, carefully, preserving it in a clear sleeve. I did not ask him why. I understood. We had been given a seat near the door. When we left, we took everything with us, including the things we had added ourselves, because those things were ours, and had always been ours, and we did not leave things behind for other people to dispose of. I walked to the docking bay without hurrying. The station corridors at that hour had their usual morning traffic. Duvari administrative staff heading to their section, a Reth maintenance team moving equipment through a side passage, 2 Veth security officers on their standard rotation. None of them looked at me. This was not unusual. People in corridors do not generally look at one another during morning routines. I had spent 11 years being invisible in these corridors, and on this particular morning, I was grateful for it, because the last thing I wanted was to explain myself. There was nothing to explain, really. That was the point. The docking bay was quiet. Our transport, a mid-range human vessel, practical and unimpressive, the kind of ship you would use for moving an embassy rather than making a statement, was docked at berth 7, which was the berth we had always been assigned because it was the farthest from the primary docking ring and required an extra corridor and a connecting lift to reach from the main station. I had made this walk hundreds of times. I made it one last time, and I noticed things I usually did not notice. The quality of the light in the connecting corridor, which was slightly different from the rest of the station, cooler and dimmer. The sound the lift made, a specific 2-tone chime that I had heard so many times it had become invisible, and was only audible to me now because I was listening for the last time. Oliver was already on board with the rest of the staff. I was the last one off the station. This was not symbolic. It was simply logistics. I had the authorization codes to close the embassy accounts and deactivate our station access credentials, and those were things that needed to be done in sequence, and the sequence ended with me. I deactivated our access credentials at the station terminal by berth 7. The process took 30 seconds. A confirmation code appeared. I entered it. The terminal thanked me. The sole delegation's presence in the Conclave Station database shifted from active to closed, voluntary, which was a status the system had apparently anticipated enough to build into its architecture, even if the Conclave itself had not anticipated it in any practical sense. I walked up the boarding ramp. The ship's outer door sealed behind me. The transport's flight deck was calm. The pilot, a quiet woman named Grace Eade, who had flown embassy runs for 7 years, and spoke very little because she had learned, as all good pilots do, that the important thing is not conversation but arrival, was already running pre-flight checks. "Ready," she said, which was both a question and a statement. "Ready," I said, which was my answer to both. We undocked from berth 7 without ceremony. The station's automated systems handled the release, logged the departure in the standard way, and moved on to the next item in their queue, because that was what automated systems did, and there was no reason for this departure to be different from any other. But it was different, because at that same moment, as our transport pulled away from berth 7 on the Conclave station, 41 other human vessels were also leaving. Not from this station, from everywhere. From the deep quarantine posts in the outer system, from the mid-ring Cascade docks, from the relay stations and archive hubs and supply depots and medical outposts, from the translation centers and the freight corridors and the 7 border monitoring installations that humanity had quietly staffed because someone had to and we had said we would. All of them, at the same time, by design, because Coordinator Nwosu and the Governing Assembly had spent 3 weeks quietly working out the logistics of something that had never been done before, and they had done it with the careful, patient precision that humans are very good at when we have decided something and are not telling anyone yet. We did not broadcast our departure. We did not send a message to the Conclave informing them of our withdrawal. We did not issue a statement or hold a press event, or request a final session, or submit a last formal objection. We left. That was all. We simply left. I found a seat in the transport's passenger section, and sat down, and looked out the small oval window as the Conclave station grew smaller behind us. It was a large structure, built over centuries by many species, full of chambers and corridors and systems, and the vast accumulated weight of decisions made by people who had the votes to make them. From the outside, at distance, it looked exactly like what it was, something that had been built without us, and had allowed us in through a door near the exit. I watched it shrink. I did not feel what I had expected to feel, which was grief, or anger, or the complicated mix of the two that had been living in my chest for 11 years and had become so familiar I had stopped noticing it. What I felt instead was simpler and much larger. It was the feeling of a breath being released after a very long time of holding it without knowing you were holding it. I exhaled. The station was a point of light now. Then it was one point among many. Then it was gone. Grace brought the ship up to standard transit speed and set us on course for Earth, and the navigation system confirmed the route with a quiet chime, and I leaned my head against the cool wall beside the window and closed my eyes, and the only thing I thought about for a long time was my brother standing in a copper sky field on a colony planet, smiling at whoever had taken the photograph, and the way I had looked at that image on the night I finally wrote the objection I did not send. We traveled for 17 hours. I slept for most of them, which surprised me, because I had not slept properly in weeks. When I woke, Earth was visible ahead through the forward display, blue and white, and exactly the right size, growing slowly larger the way it always did when you were coming home after a long time away, not rushing toward you, just waiting, patient, perfectly sure of its own existence. Oliver brought me a cup of tea without being asked, and I drank it while looking at Earth getting larger in the display, and neither of us said anything for a while. "Do you think they noticed yet?" he said eventually. I thought about the morning session at the conclave, the chamber filling up, the delegates taking their seats, The arbiter opening the queue, the smooth mechanical rhythm of a body that had been running for centuries and knew exactly how to keep running. I thought about the moment, sometime in the last 17 hours, when someone would have opened the sole delegation roster and found it empty. Not offline, not unavailable, closed, voluntary. Someone noticed something, I said, but they probably don't know yet what it means. Oliver nodded. He looked out at Earth. What does it mean? He said, not challenging, genuinely asking, the way he always did when he wanted to understand something precisely. I thought about 42 vessels now absent from their posts. I thought about the quarantine stations running on automated systems that were not designed for indefinite autonomous operation. I thought about the Cascade docks in the mid-ring with their specific mechanical requirements that human engineers had maintained, and no other certified team existed to maintain. I thought about the translation archives going dark, the supply routes with no human freight handlers, the border monitoring posts sending their standard automated reports to a delegation address that no longer had anyone checking it. It means, I said carefully, that in about 72 hours, someone in the conclave is going to ask a question they have never had to ask before. What question? Who is running the things the humans were running? Oliver was quiet for a moment. And the answer, he said. I drank the last of my tea. Earth was very large in the display now. I could see the curve of the coast of West Africa, which was where I had grown up, which was where I was going back to for the first time in 11 years. That, I said, is the answer. I learned about the first 3 days inside the conclave from a message sent by a Duvari researcher named Ven, who I had known for 8 years in the way you know someone who works in the same institution, when you are both junior enough to eat lunch in the same cafeteria. We had maintained a correspondence that was professional in its official capacity, and genuinely warm in its personal one, and she was careful in her writing, careful enough to signal, without ever stating directly, that she was taking a certain risk in sending these particular observations, and that I should read between lines that she had left deliberately wide. What she described, in the measured language of a scientist reporting field conditions, was a specific kind of institutional confusion that I suspect the conclave's architects had never modeled, because it was the confusion of an organization that had never seriously considered the scenario in which one of its members was not present. It had started, as she told it, with a routine operations report on the morning of the second day. The automated relay stations in the sectors adjacent to human space had filed their standard overnight logs, but the confirmation receipts that were supposed to come back from the Sol delegation's monitoring team had not arrived. This happened occasionally with communications delays, and so the arbiter's system had flagged it as a low-priority communications anomaly and queued it for review. By the afternoon of the second day, the Cascade maintenance dock in Mid-Ring Sector 4 had transmitted an automated alert. Its scheduled certification review, due that day, had no confirmed human technician assigned. The alert went to the Conclave Operations Office, which forwarded it to the Sol delegation's embassy address, which generated an automatic response indicating that the Sol delegation's communication systems were no longer in service at this location. This, Ven wrote, was when the first person in the conclave asked the question. Not a senior delegate, not Veth Karn. A mid-level operations coordinator, named something she rendered as ESAT, from the Reth Collective, who had been responsible for mid-ring sector maintenance logistics for 11 years. As long as I had been an ambassador, I noticed, though I did not say this aloud, and who had what Ven described as an extremely methodical mind that was, on this particular day, running into something that did not fit his methods. Esat had pulled the Sol delegation's operational agreements. There were 43 of them. He had checked the status of each one. Most were showing nominal automated function, which would hold for somewhere between 6 and 90 days depending on system type, before requiring human-certified intervention. The Cascade docks would need certified review within 30 days, or they would automatically downgrade to restricted access. The deep quarantine stations could run on autonomous protocol for 60 days, before requiring a staffed medical assessment, at which point they would initiate a mandatory lockdown that could not be overridden without a certified biological authority on site. The Cross-Species Translation Archives indexing system had already flagged 17 pending updates that required human clearance authorization, and were currently held in queue. None of this was an immediate emergency. That was the specific quality of it that I had thought about carefully when designing our departure, and that I suspected Esat was now sitting with in a way that was quietly dismaying. Nothing was immediately broken. Everything was fine. For now, for somewhere between 30 and 90 days, after which things would begin to fail in cascading sequence, and the cascade would be difficult to stop, because the specific capabilities that would be needed to stop it were the capabilities that were no longer present. Esat had taken his findings to his senior coordinator, who had taken them to the operations director, who had taken them, on the afternoon of the third day, to an emergency subcommittee convened by none other than the Arbiter itself, which had calculated, from the operational data, that the situation warranted Tier 1 attention. Veth Karn had attended the subcommittee session. Ven had not been in the room, but she had spoken to someone who was, and she relayed what was said with the careful detachment of someone transcribing a historical event that they were fairly sure would become significant. Veth Karn had asked where the humans were. Someone had said, "Departed, voluntary closure, effective 48 hours ago." There had been a pause. Veth Karn had asked, "All of them?" Someone had checked. Yes, all 42 operational positions, all embassy staff, all diplomatic and support personnel, the ambassador, the operations teams, the archivists, the technical staff, the medics at the quarantine stations, the engineers at the Cascade docks, all of them, at the same time, with no prior announcement, no resignation notice, no formal withdrawal declaration, no request for a transition period, nothing in the correct format submitted through the correct portal. They had simply not been there one morning. The chair near the door was empty. Ven wrote that the pause after this report was described to her as notably long for a room full of people accustomed to making decisions quickly. She wrote this without additional comment, which told me everything. Then Veth Karn had asked who was currently managing the deep quarantine stations. The answer was, automated systems. He had asked who would manage them when the automated systems reached their operational limit. The answer was, in 60 days, no one certified. He had asked who was certified to perform this function outside of the Sol delegation. The answer was, after some searching, no one currently active in the Conclave system. There had been a Felani certification program discontinued 30 years ago. There was a theoretical qualification pathway for Duvari biologic specialists, but it required 18 months of training and had no current enrollment. He had asked about the Cascade docks. The answer was similar. The docks themselves were fine. Human-certified engineers had, over 30 years of operating them, developed a specific understanding of the drive system's mechanical architecture that was not formally documented anywhere in transferable form, because it had accumulated through practice and was held in the minds and hands of the people who did it, and those people were now on their way home. He had asked about the translation archives. The answer was that 17 updates were in queue, and the indexing system would begin generating errors in approximately 3 weeks if the queue was not processed, and that the indexing system was designed around human-developed taxonomy logic and would require significant restructuring to operate under a different framework. At this point in the subcommittee, Ven's source reported, Veth Karn had been quiet for an unusually long time. When he spoke again, he had said something that she rendered for me in careful translation, noting that the exact phrasing was important. I was not aware that we depended on them to this extent. Not, I was not aware they did these things. Not, I did not know they were so involved. He had said, depended on them, and Ven underlined those words, because she knew me well enough to know that I would want to see them. I read her message 3 times. I was sitting in the living room of my family home in Accra, which smelled of my mother's cooking, and the specific quality of light that came through those windows in the afternoon, and which was the opposite of the conclave station, in almost every physical and emotional way imaginable. Outside, my brother's children were running around the garden making noise. My brother was sitting on the back step watching them and drinking something cold, and when I had arrived he had hugged me for a long time without saying anything, and I had let him, because some things do not require language. I set down Ven's message and picked up the secondary report that Coordinator Nwosu's office had sent, which was a compiled summary of all incoming conclave communications since the withdrawal. It was a longer document. I went through it methodically. The first formal attempt at contact had come 26 hours after our departure, a standard conclave message routed to the Seoul Delegation Embassy address, which no longer existed. It had generated the automatic response. Communications at this address are no longer in service. The second attempt had come 30 hours after departure, a direct message from the Conclave Operations Office to Earth's Central Communications Relay, requesting confirmation of the Seoul delegation's status. Earth's relay had received it and forwarded it to the Interstellar Relations Assembly. The Assembly had not replied. Not because they had missed it, not because they were deciding what to say. They had received it, noted it, and chosen silence, not rudely, not with any hostility. The way you sometimes choose silence when you have spent a very long time being thanked into it and have decided that the other person can sit with it for a while. The third attempt had come on the fourth day. A formal conclave communication sent through the Earth Standard Diplomatic Channel, marked Tier 1 priority, from the Conclave Operations Directorate. It requested an immediate status update and asked whether the withdrawal was temporary or permanent, and whether there was a designated human contact for operational transition matters. Coordinator Nuosu had drafted the reply herself. I had not been consulted, which meant she had not needed to consult me, which meant she had known exactly what to say. It was 6 sentences. The first confirmed that the withdrawal was deliberate. The second noted that no operational transition arrangement had been established, as the withdrawal had not involved a transition process. The third said that Earth was available to discuss future arrangements, including any potential return to the conclave, through formal diplomatic channels at a mutually agreeable time. The fourth noted that Earth's current diplomatic availability was limited, as the Interstellar Relations Assembly was engaged in a comprehensive internal review of its galactic engagement priorities. The fifth said that Earth anticipated this review would be complete in approximately 4 to 6 months. The sixth said that we appreciated the conclave's interest and wished them well in the interim. It was the most beautiful document I had ever read in my professional life. It was impeccably polite. It communicated, with great warmth and precision, exactly what it intended to communicate, which was, we are not in a hurry, and we have decided, for the moment, that our time is ours. I sent Coordinator Nuosu a private message that said only, 743 objections. Thank you. She replied 4 minutes later. Read every one. The internal developments inside the conclave that followed over the next several weeks came to me through Ven's periodic messages, through the formal response traffic that Nuosu's office shared with me, and through the steady, observable pressure of practical consequence. The quarantine stations were operating, but the 60-day clock was running. The Cascade docks had entered restricted access at the 30-day mark, which meant that several mid-ring freight operators were now running longer routes around sectors they used to transit directly, adding cost and time to supply chains that had been calibrated around the assumption that those docks were open. The translation archive had begun generating errors, which had caused a cross-species documentation project involving 7 conclave members to stall, because 3 of the languages involved were only indexed in the human-maintained system. None of these were catastrophes. They were inconveniences. But they were inconveniences of a very particular kind, the kind that made people ask questions they had never needed to ask before, and that produced answers which changed the shape of what people thought they understood. What people had understood, for 30 years, was that humanity was a Tier 2 observer, with a great deal of potential, and a regrettable tendency to bring emotional investment to procedural matters. What they were beginning to understand, in the 6th week after our departure, was something different. The quarantine stations and the Cascade docks and the translation archives had not been services that humanity provided as a condition of our membership, as dues paid for the privilege of the chair near the door. They were things we had done because the work needed doing, and we were capable of it, and we had said we would, and the conclave had accepted our capability and our word, and had not, apparently, considered very carefully what things would look like if one day we decided to stop. In the 7th week, a formal delegation from the conclave arrived in Earth orbit, requesting in-person discussions. The delegation included 3 Tier 1 representatives, a conclave operations director, and a Duvari mediator whose role, as far as I could tell, was to demonstrate good faith through the presence of a species that humanity generally had warm relations with. This was not a bad read of the situation. The Duvari mediator was a thoughtful choice. What was notable was who was in the delegation, not who was included, but who was leading it. Veth Karn, not a representative, not a junior diplomat sent to test the temperature. The elder himself, the most senior member of the most powerful delegation in the conclave, traveling personally to Earth to request a conversation. They were made to wait 4 days. This was because Earth's diplomatic calendar was, in fact, fully scheduled during that period. The internal review that Coordinator Nwosu had mentioned was genuinely in progress, and our governing bodies did not restructure their schedules to accommodate last-minute arrivals, even Tier 1 ones. This was explained politely, and the delegation was offered comfortable accommodation in the interim. The accommodation was, I was told, pleasant but not lavish, which was exactly correct. On the 5th day, the delegation was received. I was on the flight back to Earth's diplomatic center when the meeting began. I was not leading the negotiation. Coordinator Nwosu was leading it, as was appropriate, because she was the head of the Interstellar Relations Assembly, and this was precisely what that role existed for. But I had been asked to attend, in an advisory capacity, and I was on my way. Ven had sent me a final message that morning, brief, as her messages often were when they contained the most important things. She had written, "He knows what he needs to say. The question is whether he can say it. I think he can. He has spent 6 weeks learning how." I read that message on the plane, and I thought about 6 weeks of questions without comfortable answers, 6 weeks of operations reports and maintenance alerts and trade route complications, 6 weeks of a very large and powerful organization discovering the shape of a thing by its absence, the way you discover the shape of a stone by the hole it leaves. Then I put my tablet away and watched the landscape pass below, green and enormous, and I thought about arriving. The chamber where the meeting was held was in the UN Interstellar Relations Building in Geneva, which was a room humans had designed, in a building humans had built, in a city that had been rebuilt twice in human history by human hands, and which smelled of something: old wood, cold air, the particular quality of light through tall windows in the morning. That was not the conclave station, and that I felt, sitting in the gallery, like a kind of slow returning to myself. Coordinator Nwosu sat at the head of the table. She was a small woman, compact and precise, with the specific quality of stillness that belongs to people who have made a great many decisions and have learned to carry them without visible weight. I had met her twice before today. Both times she had struck me as someone who did not waste anything, not words, not attention, not the careful arrangement of what was said and what was not. Across from her, the conclave delegation, 3 Tier 1 representatives, the operations director, the Duvari mediator, and at the center, Veth Karn, who looked, I thought, slightly different from the last time I had seen him. Not smaller, he was still physically enormous, the same 4 square eyes, the same layered formal attire, but there was something in the way he held himself that had changed in 6 weeks. And I found that I recognized it, because I had watched it happen to myself in reverse over 11 years. He looked like someone who had recently learned something he would have preferred not to know. I was in the gallery above the main floor. I could not participate in the session directly. I was there to observe and advise, and to provide a record for Earth's diplomatic archive, and, if I was being honest with myself, which I was trying to practice, because Coordinator Nwosu had told me I deserved to be in the room when this happened. "You filed 743 objections," she had said when she called. "Come and see what they were worth." I had a notebook with me. It was a physical one, the old kind, because I had gotten into the habit of writing important things by hand. I wrote the date at the top of a new page. The session opened with Coordinator Nwosu welcoming the delegation, in the conclave's standard formal register, with all the correct protocols, because we were not people who abandoned good manners even when our patience was finished. The Duvari mediator offered formal greetings on behalf of the group. The Tier 1 representatives presented the conclave's opening position, which was a carefully worded statement about the importance of galactic community and the mutual benefits of sustained cooperation, and the conclave's deep respect for Earth's contributions, and its hope for a renewed engagement that would reflect humanity's essential role in the broader interstellar framework. It was well written. I had to give them that. It was much better than the warm, empty messages of previous years. It used the word essential, which was new. It used the phrase, humanity's contributions, without the qualifier, potential. These were not small changes. Someone had done the work of changing them, and I noted that. But it did not contain the word. Coordinator Nwosu listened to the full statement without interruption. Then she was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "We appreciate the care that has gone into this statement, and we hear the sincerity behind it." She opened a folder on the table in front of her. She did not look at its contents. She already knew what was in it. "I would like to table several items for formal discussion," she said. "Before we proceed to those items, I want to ask a direct question, and I want to ask it of Ambassador Veth Karn specifically, because he has led the primary delegation for the majority of the period in question, and because I believe that directness, at this stage, serves us both better than procedure." Veth Karn was very still, 4 eyes, arranged in a square, looking at her. "In the 30 years of our conclave membership," Coordinator Nwosu said, "what specific errors were made in the treatment of the Sol delegation, and what is the conclave's position on those errors?" The room was quiet. The Duvari mediator made a very small movement that might, in their species, have been a held breath. The operations director looked at the table. The Tier 1 representatives looked at Veth Karn. Veth Karn looked at Coordinator Nwosu. For a long moment he said nothing, and I thought about what Ven had written. He knows what he needs to say. The question is whether he can say it. And then he said it. Not easily. Not smoothly. The way he spoke in the conclave chamber where the language of authority came to him like water. He said it the way you say something when you have spent 6 weeks with it, and have decided that the only way out is through it, and that the cost of not saying it is higher than the cost of what it requires you to be. He said that the conclave had failed to treat humanity as an equal member. He said that the structural tier system had been allowed to function as a permanent hierarchy, rather than a transitional classification, and that this had been permitted to continue beyond any reasonable interpretation of its original intent. He said that the interruptions of Sol delegation speakers in session had not been adequately addressed by the presiding systems, and that this constituted a failure of procedural fairness. He said that the emergency reclassification request regarding the agricultural pathogen, I wrote the number in my notebook, 733, which was when I had first submitted it, had been delayed beyond any ethical standard, and that this had resulted in preventable harm. He said, "We made serious errors. The conclave takes responsibility for them." He paused. Then he said the word, "I apologize." 3 words in conclave standard. He said them clearly, at the table, for the record, in the official session transcript, which would be broadcast across the conclave network as part of the meeting documentation within 48 hours. I counted them, not 3 words. I counted the syllables in his original language, because I had learned enough of it over 11 years in the same building, and the phrase was 17 syllables long, and I wrote 17 in my notebook beside the date, and I sat back in the gallery chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, because I needed to look at something that was not a face. Coordinator Nwosu received the apology without drama. She said it was noted and accepted, and that Earth appreciated the effort required to offer it genuinely, and that she believed it was genuine. Then she opened her folder. The folder contained the terms. Full Tier 1 voting membership, effective immediately upon ratification, retroactive consultation rights on all decisions affecting human space for the previous 5 years. Formal credit attribution for all scientific contributions made by human researchers and incorporated into conclave databases without citation, identified through a joint review process. Sovereignty guarantees codified at Tier 1 level for all space-designated human territory. Co-administration of all transit corridors passing through human-controlled regions, with joint management rights and veto capacity on corridor usage. Additionally, and this was the item that I watched Veth Karn read twice, a formal review of the conclave's classification system, to be conducted jointly, with Earth's participation as a co-author of any revised framework. Not as an observer, as a co-author. The negotiations took 8 hours. They were thorough and specific and occasionally difficult in the way that any negotiation is difficult when both parties are trying to be precise and the details matter. I went down to the floor at hour 3 to advise on 3 items in the transit co-administration section, because I had the operational knowledge of those routes in my head, in a way that made me the most useful person in the room for those specific questions. I sat beside Coordinator Nwosu. I presented data. I was listened to. I finished my sentences. By late afternoon, the agreement was complete. Veth Karn signed it. Coordinator Nwosu signed it. The Conclave Operations Director and the Duvari Mediator signed it as witnesses. An Earth legal officer signed it and filed it in the formal diplomatic record. After the signing, there was a brief reception, tea, which I found funny in a private way, though I drank it. And the delegation was gracious, and the mood was one of cautious optimism, which was the right mood for an agreement that everyone understood had been reached through difficulty and would require sustained good faith to maintain. I stood near the tall windows with a cup of tea and looked out at the city. Geneva in the early evening had a specific beauty that belonged only to itself. The water of the lake in the distance, the old buildings and the lights coming on, the sky going from pale gold to deep blue at the edges. I had not stood at a window looking at this city in 11 years. It was still here. It had been here the whole time. Oliver appeared at my shoulder with a plate of something small and biscuit-like that had been put out for the reception. He offered the plate. I took one. 743, he said. 743, I said. He looked out the window alongside me. Are you glad we came back? He said. I thought about it properly, because he had asked it properly, not as a pleasantry, but as a real question that deserved a real answer. Yes, I said, but not for the reason I would have given you 11 years ago. What's the reason now? I looked at the lake in the distance, silver in the last light. 11 years ago, I would have said I was glad because we were finally getting what we deserved, and I wanted the recognition. That was true. It was honest. I drank the last of the tea. But now I think the thing I am most glad about is that we learned something that took us 30 years and an empty chair to learn, that we had been trying to earn a seat we already deserved, that we had been asking for permission to be taken seriously in a room where we were already carrying more weight than anyone had told us. Oliver was quiet for a moment. And now? Now we know what we are worth. We didn't know before. Not really. Not in the way that it counts. We knew it intellectually, but we didn't know it the way you know something when you've tested it. Outside, the city lights were coming fully on now, and the lake had gone dark silver, and somewhere behind me the reception was winding down, and Coordinator Nwosu was saying something precise and warm to the Duvari mediator, and the agreement was already in the formal record, and in 48 hours it would be broadcast across the Conclave network, with the transcript of Veth Karn's 17 syllables included. And somewhere right now my brother was probably standing in his field under a copper sky, not thinking about any of this, because his children needed dinner, and the growing season was turning, and the shelves were starting to fill back up. I placed my empty cup on a nearby table. I straightened my jacket. I turned away from the window and went back into the room, because there was still work to do, and we were good at work, and now we were going to do it on our own terms, in a room where the chair was not near the door, and we did not need to ask permission to finish our sentences. We had left without a word. We came back knowing every single one.